Next topic is a little different. So I don't think you'll see the mainstream media talk about these two guys. They'll probably talk about Ja, but they won't talk about the other guy. But these are the two, I'd say, the people who performed the best in the playoffs for the Memphis Grizzlies, and that's Ja Morant and Dillon Brooks. And I think most of us believe this, but they're the most underrated duo in these playoffs as of right now that just people aren't talking about, that are putting up really good numbers and, leading a team that maybe was kind of written off before the start or before the play-in games, but is now performing. They're doing well. They're tied 1-1 currently against the Jazz. But Noel, thoughts on Ja Morant and the Dillon Brooks duo?
Yeah, so very interesting, honestly, because I think a lot of people who haven't been watching the playoffs or the recent NBA games think of the Grizzlies as almost just Ja Morant doing acrobatic, crazy stuff, getting on highlight reels, and then a bunch of other kind of guys who shoot threes, maybe are good, like Jonah Valanciunas, good in the boards or whatnot. But the people who have been watching this series, there's also another guy who's maybe not as acrobatic, but getting buckets and on some good defenders too, and basically wherever he wants to. I think in the last game, his stat line was something like 10 for 12. It was pretty ridiculous in terms of percentage-wise. And that man is Dillon Brooks. And one thing about Dillon Brooks that is awesome, and I'm sure you guys will touch on, is just the heart and the intensity he plays with, because he goes hard every second, and he's certified bucket. So I would say that the mainstream media probably won't talk about this. They'll probably only show you Ja Morant acrobatic plays. But there's another guy here. That's Dillon Brooks, and this duo is legit, is what I got to say.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I mean, you touched on a lot of really important things, like how well Dillon Brooks has been shooting the ball in these playoffs, how well both these guys compete. I do want to point out one thing, and Noel, I know you'll love it because you're kind of the biggest person I've ever met when it comes to talking basketball. You're like the biggest stickler on it. Both these guys are two-way players, and I know that you're big on that because you basically all the players you like, they got to play defense first. And both of these guys are very, very good defenders, especially for a young age, at their young age. I mean, there's a lot to talk about, right? Ja Morant had a 40 ball in the playoffs against the 1 seed as the 8th seed on the road in Utah, a hostile environment. That's special stuff, especially with his parents being, whatever happened with that. That was messed up. Like, that shouldn't be happening. His parents should be allowed to enjoy their son playing basketball. And Dillon Brooks, his defense on Steph Curry in the play-in game was well documented. Even though Steph put like 37 on him, it was probably the toughest 37 Steph's had to put up in a long, long time. So, like, you can talk about all of those things. To me, there's one thing that stood out to me that's made Ja Morant so special. And obviously, like, Ja Morant, Dillon Brooks, incredible duo, but I just wanted to single out Ja Morant in particular. So I think what happens to a lot of young point guards, especially in the first playoff series, is because, one, it's slower pace, more half court, and defenses are more prepared on how they want to play them. They turn the ball over a lot. Ja Morant has played 79 minutes in this series against the number one defense statistically in the NBA, in the Utah Jazz. He's turned the ball over 5 times. That's unbelievable. Mm-hmm. That tells you how poised he's playing. That tells you how smart he's playing. That tells you how good his decision-making. Just in comparison, Luka Doncic, prior to tonight's game, had also played 79 minutes in 2 games. He had turned the ball over 10 times against the Clippers. And we know how special Luka is. I mean, almost all of us think he's a top 6-7 player in the NBA. I think he's top 5. So it just tells you how special Ja Morant has been in terms of his composure and what he's been doing and how smart he's been playing. And yes, absolutely, this duo is unbelievable. I think they're going to be a trio once Jaren Jackson gets fully healthy. And the Memphis Grizzlies play hard. They play defense. They play smart basketball. And Ja Morant is as tough as they come. I think they could be very, very good for years down the road.
So, Vish, there's one thing I do disagree with what you said. And you said the trio would include Jaren Jackson, but we're forgetting someone formerly known as Slow-Mo, Kyle Anderson. Pretty disappointed you left him off that list.
Yeah, I would agree. A little bit.
My bad.
But to move on from that and talk about Morant and Brooks, so obviously, everyone loves Ja Morant. I think unless your team has gotten 40-pieced by him, you will love him. But yeah, obviously, like, insane finishing and what he did against the Grizzlies, like you said, this is his first playoffs, and he dropped 47 against Spida Mitchell, Rudy Gobert, Royce O'Neal, and all the other, guards and members of the Jazz that have contributed to that number one defense. And that's just special right there. I'm impressed that his 3-point shooting has been pretty decently improved in the playoffs. I know he doesn't really take a lot of threes and he doesn't make a lot of threes, but he's done a better job at that. And I think you highlighted it well, Vish, with the turnovers only being 5. It seems like when he does get doubled, then that's a decent amount because he is the primary playmaker. He knows exactly where he's going with the ball, and he can drop some dimes. His passing is really, really underrated, and I think that's kind of something that, you won't see the highlights of. You'll see the highlights of him making a sweet dunk or, jumping with above 40-inch vertical, but his passing is super underrated and very skillful. And then Dillon Brooks, I wasn't the biggest fan of this guy. The first few times I saw him, I thought he was a little out of control, and there is still moments of where, he'll just try to charge through the lane like he's Russell Westbrook and just take over and turn the ball over, and that's kind of an issue, but he makes some very tough shots, like one of the best tough shot makers, and he is really strong. And then his defense, you mentioned his defense on Steph. His defense on Steph was phenomenal, and he kind of is one of those guys who has a chip on his shoulder, and, he's always barking at other players, and I do love that. It kind of brings back just the, I guess, more older version of basketball where players were always barking at each other and, you weren't accidentally hitting someone and a foul was called every time. And I don't know. Sounded like an old hat here, but I do like when players are chirping others, and Dillon Brooks does that. So shout outs to both of them. And they've both performed very well for having very little experience. And that is something that you don't always see, especially as an 8th seed going against the 1 seed. They've performed great, and in the playing games, they were very resilient in, obviously beating the Spurs and playing well against the Warriors as well.
I got a question for you guys. I know there's a little bit of recency bias to this, but we're talking about 2 players. I'm going to bring up 2 players that have been all-stars in the league, one this year, one last year. Who are you taking moving forward? Ja Morant, Dillon Brooks, or Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson?
Spicy question right there. That is spicy.
I would take Brandon Ingram and Zion probably.
Yeah, I would too. I think the success dispute between the teams would have to do more with the supporting casts.
And the coach.
Yeah, and the coach. Yeah. I think the Grizzlies are superior in both contexts. But yeah, I'm siding with Zion and B.I. But I do think it's very interesting because of the similarities in age, with both being pretty young players in the league.
So I'm actually going to take Ja Morant and Dillon Brooks, and here's why. I think Zion Williamson and Brandon Ingram are the more talented duo. I think they're both the better duo in terms of better individual players. I think Zion Williamson is the best player of these 4, even though Ja Morant obviously has been unbelievable in these playoffs. Like Zion Williamson was averaging like 25 on 60% this year. Here's the reason why, though. I think they complement each other way better than Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson. One of my biggest takeaways from this season, other than obviously Stan Van Gundy still remains the horrible coach that he was on my Pistons, and he's still that coach for the Pelicans, is that I don't think Zion Williamson and Brandon Ingram work for each other. I think Brandon Ingram needs to go to a place where he can be the solo star and he can take up shots. And he needs to take 22 shots a game. And some are going to be really bad shots, but he needs to take those shots. And Zion Williamson, obviously, they featured him more towards the end of the season, but there shouldn't be games where Zion Williamson is shooting 10 for 12. Zion Williamson should be shooting 25 shots every single game. And you got to put the ball in his hands every single possession. And that kind of eliminates what Brandon Ingram can do, because Brandon Ingram is not a great spot-up shooter. He's not a great off-ball mover. And so I think Ja and Dillon Brooks gel with each other better because they can both guard, but you can rest Ja a little bit and put Dillon Brooks on that point guard and have Ja take the shooting guard, and they complement each other in the sense that Dillon Brooks is a very good catch-and-shoot three-point shooter. He's a very good off-ball player, and he can also handle the ball and give Ja rest that way. And Ja, obviously, Blake, you touched on it, he's shooting the ball, even though percentage-wise in these playoffs, he's not blowing anybody away. The confidence that he's shooting these open threes with is unbelievable. I mean, they basically played 2007 LeBron defense against him in the play-in tournament, where it was like Greg Popovich, like, drop off of him. Make him shoot. Let's see if he can make it. And Ja Morant stepped into those 3-pointers and kept drilling them one by one. I think he made 5 in the game, which is a very, very good number. Even though they were open, you still got to make them. They were daring him to shoot, and he said, yeah, keep daring me. I'm going to keep knocking them down. So because of that, like, obviously this, like, recency bias would definitely say Ja Morant, Dillon Brooks. They're in the playoffs. They're dogs. They're all of this. But just because of the way they complement each other and the fact that I don't think you need to split them up for both of them to be the best versions of themselves, I'm going to go with Ja Morant and Dillon Brooks.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I would say it comes down to, what you said with individual talent versus a duo in itself, because I do agree with the points that Ja and Dillon Brooks complement each other's style of play a lot better than Zion and Brandon Ingram, even though maybe individually Zion and Brandon Ingram could be better in themselves. So I would say it comes down to that. Very interesting. And regardless, though, people who haven't really been paying attention to Dillon Brooks and Ja should in this series because it's a duo. That's what I would say.
Definitely. Yeah, I don't have much more to add, but that is an interesting thought. Obviously Ja and Zion get compared a lot because, one was pick 1, one was pick 2. So those comparisons will always be there, but no one, I guess, I've never heard the comparison of Brandon Ingram and Dillon Brooks. I think that's probably the first time any human being has ever thought of that comparison. So Vish. Thank you for bringing that up, Vish. Because it was actually it was funny, but it was a good comparison. But yeah, so I guess bottom line here, Ja Morant and Dillon Brooks, you need to more than just watch their ESPN highlights of only Ja, because this is a very underrated duo for the Memphis Grizzlies.